Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Christy McClear to the stage.
Hello, I'm Christy McClear, Vice Chair of MAS. I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge some of the other board members in the audience. Lisa Cashin, Bobby Paley, Michael Donovan, and Janet Ross. I want to welcome you all today. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next presentation. It's the third in a series of releases from MAS's Accidental Skyline project. The Accidental Skyline project began in 2013 when MAS noticed something unusual brewing along 57th Street in Manhattan. A forest of slender, super tall towers had started breaking ground seemingly overnight, which would soon cast shadows a mile long onto Central Park. Moreover, they had managed to sidestep the city's zoning code and public review process you would expect for towers this large and looming, so close to public space. 4 years ago, we released our first Skyline report, a series of shadow studies demonstrating that the existing regulations do not sufficiently protect public space, nor do they provide predictable framework for guiding development. The response we heard from developers was an almost universal brush-off. We were told that advocates were too late to the game, that the vast pockets of unused air rights to build a super tall tower had been cashed in. We were told that reform was a waste of time. We decided to test that theory, and the following year, we released the Accidental Skyline FAR maps, the first interactive tool that let ordinary New Yorkers find out whether their neighborhoods might still see new super tall towers. We identified several communities, and we predicted which would serve for the next frontier of these super talls. And indeed, within a few years, towers over 600 feet were proposed in Sutton Place, Long Island City, Williamsburg, downtown Brooklyn, Lower Manhattan, Lower East Side, Flatiron, and Hudson Yards. Today, we're back with a new report, the theme of which is enough is enough. We've shown that this unprecedented boom in as-of-right, out-of-context development is citywide systemic problem. And we've taken the hard work to reform in our own hands a compiled and comprehensive series of recommendations for New Yorkers to finally take control. Tall buildings are nothing new for our city, and MAS is not opposed to skyscrapers themselves, but the public has never been told to settle for an accidental skyline before, and we shouldn't start to now. Please welcome to the stage Elizabeth Goldstein, who will debut this ambitious new work.
Great. As Christy has described, MAS has been toiling in this mine for a while, and we're delighted to share with you the latest report on New York's accidental skyline. Slide. New Yorkers are remarkably adaptable people. We adjust constantly to changes in our city, in our neighborhoods, and we're hard to surprise. But the latest iteration of our changing skyline is doing just that, triggering surprise and even disorientation. Slide. The bewilderment so many New Yorkers are feeling is also often followed by consternation about how these super talls could be approved, and then anger when we learn that many of the most egregious among them did not go through any public review process at all. So what's the problem? The latest generation of slender, hyper-tall buildings we see dominating the New York skyline are a result of antiquated zoning regulations that, when coupled with an extremely competitive real estate market and advanced construction technology, have fostered a frenzy of speculative development. Since the framers of the 1961 zoning resolution never predicted buildings of this size and scope, most super talls escape the city's uniform land use review procedure or the city's environmental quality review processes. They are built instead under a process called as of right. As a result, many residents are stunned to discover that a new super tall has broken ground in their neighborhood. Even after plans are made public, significant post-approval amendments may be made to forge buildings even taller, well after the window for public input or legal challenge has passed, if there was an opportunity in the first place. Slide, please. For the 10% of projects that do undergo public review, inherent deficiencies and flaws in that these processes persist. Despite community input, the finished product often ends up being out of context with the surrounding neighborhood, casting it in shadow, blocking critical view corridors, and spoiling both streetscape and skyline. This animation shows shadow projections during the winter solstice as the skyline was in 2014. Next slide. And this is how it might look in 2025. With these visuals, we're able to see how much of the city's skyline will change and understand how valuable assets such as light, air, and public spaces will be negatively impacted in the near future. Next slide. What are the causes? Outdated zoning regulations are one cause. Air right transfers and zoning lot mergers are two of the primary mechanisms by which developers build significantly larger buildings and avoid the scrutiny of the city's public review processes. Another mechanism is the use of the 1961 zoning resolution's height factor buildings. Height factor regulations were designed to promote the construction of tall buildings with accompanying open space in certain residential zoning districts. Creative interpretations by developers and loose enforcement by the Department of Buildings has led to a substantial decline in the quality of qualifying open spaces utilized in building permit applications. And lastly, the use of voids in super talls is another way to build bigger buildings than the zoning code would lead you to expect. Disguised as accessory mechanical spaces, these empty spaces insert uncounted volume into buildings, putting residential spaces high up, increasing views, and with that, boosting the prices of these apartments and ultimately property values. In some cases, structural voids have added 100 feet or more to building heights. A second cause is deficient environmental review. May I have the next slide? Of course, not all super talls go up as of right. Some are the result of rezonings and other discretionary land actions. Unfortunately, these evaluations frequently underestimate the scale of development and fail to effectively evaluate their fullest impact. As a result, effective mitigation measures are often not considered, leaving neighborhoods to deal with the consequences of diminished sunlight, traffic congestion, limited open space, crowded schools, noise, poor air quality, and other negative consequences. In addition to evaluating a project's potential environmental effects, SECR regulations also require the identification of mitigation measures to offset adverse effects. Despite these requirements, there is no mechanism in place to confirm that mitigation measures have been implemented, let alone tested to prove their efficacy once a project is constructed. May I have the next slide? And the last major cause is the lack of public input. While the city has initiated many wide-scale rezonings through the 5 boroughs under the Planning for Livability, Affordability, Community, Economic Opportunity, and Sustainability Initiative, called PLACES, it has demonstrated an aversion to approving or even considering community-driven planning efforts. Though the current administration has improved engagement with communities, rezonings and other land use actions are still driven by the city's agenda and not by community interests. I will briefly, next slide please. I will briefly touch on some of the case studies mentioned in the report that expose dysfunctions in these 3 general areas: outdated zoning regulations, deficient environmental review processes, and a lack of public input. Next slide. How do these problems manifest themselves in the city of the future? This is a view of the Brooklyn Bridge facing Lower Manhattan as it looked in 2014. Next slide. If all developments materialize, this is how it will look in 2025. Next slide. This particular building reflects many of the tools that are being used to affect supertalls as of right. Air right transfers are at issue in this example. This is 80 South Street. At the proposed height of almost 1,500 feet, the development would be the second tallest building in the city with a predominant residential use. In 2015, the developer acquired 2 adjacent parcels and over 420 square feet, 20,000, square feet of air rights from the Hughes Corporation. Adding to the previous transfer, the total amount of air rights comprised over 500,000 square feet. If you look at the yellow and orange highlight proportions of the building, you will see that these air rights transfers double what you would expect to be built at this site based on zoning. Air right transfers are not subject to public disclosure by and large. Next slide. This is another proposed building at 15 East 30th Street, not very far from where we are today, utilizing structural voids. In blue on this diagram are disguised mechanical spaces which are not counted as developed square footage, increasing the height of the building. Next slide. These structural voids are evaluated by the Department of Buildings and in some cases add literally hundreds of feet to the building height for the purpose of getting views up above the surrounding structures. Next slide. Another example of outdated regulations is the current proposal for 200 Amsterdam on the Upper West Side. The developer is advancing this project thanks to a lot assemblage that was created in 1987. Through zoning lot mergers, most of the proposed zoning floor area would be generated through the site's resulting exceptionally large and irregular zoning lot, shown in red, which resembles a gerrymandered electoral district. Next slide. That tool is illustrated even more clearly on this map. The red outlines the new zoning lot. This creative but obscure tactic increased the lot from just over 7,000 square feet to 110,000 square feet. And because the lot is restricted by height factor regulations, the building requires a substantial amount of surrounding open space. However, almost half of the open space of the gerrymandered lot consists of parking lots that are accessory to other existing buildings and which will not be accessible to the new residents. MAS contends that the proposal falls substantially short of the minimum open space requirement, and if built, it will not be compliant with zoning. Next slide. This is a view of Fort Greene facing towards downtown Brooklyn. Next slide. If all developments materialize, this is how it will look in the year 2020. These projects result from a city-initiated rezoning, but the environmental review process did not take into account all of the development air rights that could be transferred. Next slide. The EIS for the 2004 Downtown Brooklyn Development Plan did not evaluate the maximum projected and potential floor area that would be developed. The tall building in the center, shaded purple, is a development at 340 Flatbush Avenue, which will be the tallest building in Brooklyn upon completion, which was not evaluated at all in the EIS. 2 other developments, when completed, have gone beyond the development projections evaluated in the project EIS, 388 Bridge Street and 100 Willoughby, the pink buildings on the right. This is not the only case in which EISs underestimate the size of developments that are actually get built. Hudson Yards, East Midtown, and East Harlem are other examples. Why is this a problem? The environmental impacts of these projects are not properly assessed. There are real on-the-ground consequences of these omissions. It means that the mitigation strategies included and presumably implemented in the redevelopment are not based on the full impacts at all. They are based on lower impacts that will be surpassed, and the community will live with them for a long time, including traffic and impacts on mass transportation, light and air, and the shadowing of parks. Next slide. The lack of community input is a critical factor in many out-of-scale developments. Many neighborhoods are still governed by decades-old urban renewal plans and large-scale residential development plans. In Lower Manhattan, this is the case with the Two Bridges large-scale residential development shown here in 2014. Next slide. There we go, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you for the heads up. Significant alteration to urban renewal plans require public review for their approval. However, occasionally the city has arbitrarily classified requested approvals as minor modifications with apparent intent to avoid public review. About a year ago, this is exactly what happened with the City Planning Commission with the Two Bridges urban renewal area. This minor modification would result in the development of over 2.5 million square feet of residential space, including 4 towers ranging in height from about 424 feet to over 1,000, without being subject to review under ULURP. Next slide. With the introduction of 6,000 new residents, the development has the potential to significantly transform the socioeconomic conditions and the character of the neighborhood. Expected adverse effects including shadows, negative impact on urban design and visual resources, natural resources, traffic and parking, water and sewage infrastructure, and solid waste management. If that list is not long enough for you, then we have something else we can add. The project is also within the 100-year floodplain. And this is a community that's actually done its own community-based planning effort, which has been ignored in this process. The classification as a minor modification and its exemption from ULURP has raised the ire of local constituents and elected officials, understandably. Next slide. So what's needed to solve these problems? 3 strategies. Close the loopholes that allow developers to skirt zoning rules and environmental regulations, give neighborhoods a seat at the table, and hold the city and developers accountable to the public interest. Next slide. How do we close loopholes that allow developers to skirt zoning rules and environmental regulations? We strengthen regulations that control height and bulk. We clarify zoning regulations and definitions. We evaluate floor area bonuses. We strengthen mitigation requirements for environmental review. And we comprehensively evaluate and disclose impacts of development. Next slide. We need to give neighborhoods a seat at the table by increasing local representation and opportunities for review of land use actions. And we also need to increase the resources and opportunities for community planning. Next slide. Lastly, we need to hold developers and the city accountable to the public interest. This requires creating new accountability measures and strengthening existing ones. Improving online resources by ensuring that data is standardized, comprehensive, and accessible, and improving development and land use applications. Next slide. This is New York today. Next slide. This is New York of the future. If the problems these developments pose are not addressed, what is at risk is a city that is darker, drearier, and more austere than its denizens deserve. A place where ordinary New Yorkers can't find an affordable apartment while faceless corporations stockpile vast investment properties. Much of this responsibility lies with the city itself, but developers also need to come to the table, and communities too must recognize the inevitable change in their neighborhoods and be willing to consider compromises that provide a fair balance between the public and private interest. We need to act together to make sure that the city that gets built is the city we want, a vibrant, bustling metropolis that creates healthy, fair housing opportunities for all of us with plenty of air and light on our sidewalks, our streets, and our parks. We must close the loopholes that allow buildings to change the paradigm of the city willy-nilly. We must demand honest and realistic evaluations of the pros and cons of any particular development and the respectful engagement with communities about their wants and needs. New York does not need to settle for an accidental skyline. Thank you.